welcome to Meeple University's How to Play Panamax. In Panamax, players play two roles at once. They play as the operator of a shipping company in the Panama Canal, and they play as a private investor operating in that market. As private investors, players buy shares in companies, either their own or others, in exchange for dividends and returns on their stock, as well as trying to operate their companies in a way which earns them the most personal money. As companies, players have to keep moving ships and cargo through the canal in order to turn a profit. The game is played over 3 rounds, and the winner of the game is the player who has accumulated the most personal money at the end of the game. Players should keep this in mind, that their aim is to gain personal money, not necessarily company money, unless that favours their strategy. To help players remember this, throughout the game where you see a coin icon by itself, it represents income for the company, and where you see a coin next to a meeple, it represents income to the player. Before I go through the mechanics of the game, I'll explain some of the components. This is the main board, representing a schematic of the Panama Canal. The canal runs around this path. There are sets of locks at each end of the canal, a narrow cut through the middle of the mountains, and a large man-made lake, just as the canal in real life, at least up until its expansion in 2016. The game has contract cards showing the types of cargo that contracts can run, and at each end of the canal there is a loading zone. There are 2 loading zones, each representing different countries or regions, which you'll see on the contracts. Up at the top there is a railway section representing the true Panama Railway, which has the turn order track on it. Each player has 9 6-sided dice in his or her colour. These dice represent the cargo which will be moved through the canal. The dice are never rolled, but rather the number of pips is set to represent the cargo based on the cards that the player takes. There are also 16 white dice. These are rolled and then drafted as part of the action drafting mechanism in the game. These are the different ships which are available in the game. There are cargo ships which carry freight cargo, cruise ships which carry cruise passengers, and military ships which carry no cargo. Each player's company has access to up to 4 cargo ships, 2 with a single slot of length, 1 with 2 slots, and 1 with 3 slots. There is also a neutral cargo ship which no player's company owns, which can hold 4 items of cargo. The cruise ships are also not owned by any player's company, but they will carry cruise passengers. And the 4 military ships each represent one of the different regions that was shown on the board before. Each player's company board has a space for company money, for ships that have not been built yet, and for ships which have been built which have not been deployed. There are spaces on here to place flag tokens and cruise ship tokens, and any of the company's unsold shares are in the corner. Off the board is the player's personal player area, where player money, player shares, and any bonus cards are kept. Actions in Panamax are selected by drafting dice from this section of the board. At the start of each round, roll a number of dice which depends on the number of players. It's 12 in a 4-player game, 9 in a 3-player game, and 10 in a 2-player game. Next, place these into the columns as indicated by the numbers at the top. So put all of the 1s in this column, all of the 2s in this column, and so on. If you have more than 3 dice in any one of these columns, cascade the excess dice down 1 space to the left, filling up to the top of the column. Carry this all the way across, and if you get to the 1s and you still have some left, cascade them to the right. Next, roll another number of dice equal to the number of players. Stack these dice on the spaces above here. 4 goes here, 2, and so on. Once again, cascade dice to the left if there is an excess, and then to the right. There should now be a total of 16 white dice on the board in a 4-player game and 12 in a 2 or 3-player game. At this point, check to make sure the dice have a sufficiently good distribution between the blue side of the board and the grey side of the board. In the 4-player game, if you have 4 or fewer dice on one side of the divide, simply sweep all the dice out and go through that whole rolling process again. In a 2 or 3-player game, do this if there are 3 or fewer dice on one side. On each player's turn, he or she chooses an action by drafting a die from this table. The die must be drafted from the bottom of its given column. So these 6 dice would be the ones available at this point in time. The action in the top space above the box becomes available only when it is the last one remaining in a column. There are 3 basic actions in this game which these dice represent. The first is movement, moving ships through the canal. The second is taking contracts and loading cargo onto ships. And the third is executive or market actions, which allows players to buy shares and manipulate the stock market. To take a movement action, the player drafts a die from the blue side of the board. To take a contract and load action, the player drafts a die from the grey side of the board. To take an executive action, the player drafts a die from this top row, that is these boxes here, regardless of which side of the divide it is on. When taking the top row die from the blue side, the player chooses either the movement action or the executive action. The player cannot do both. Similarly, on the grey side, taking the top row die gives the player contract and load or executive, but not both. Each die grants the player a slightly different number of sub-actions within the main action. This is printed on the board. So for example, this die here gives the player 1 lock type movement, which I'll describe later, as shown at the bottom of the column, and 3 waterway type movements, shown at the top of the column. The number of lock movements increases along here, and the number of waterway movements increases as you move up the column. Similarly, on the contract side, each column gives the player access to 1 contract, but the number of load actions that the player gains escalates from 1 up to 3 as you draft up the column. If taking the die from the executive action row, but doing the main action, that die is treated as if it is on this space. So you'll get the benefit at the bottom and the top one here, 3 waterway and 1 lock. If the player does not like the dice that are available, there is an option to move dice from one side of the board to the other for a cost. To do this, the player chooses the lowest die in a given column. This can either be in the executive action space or in the main part of the board. Let's say this one's chosen. The player then pays $5 from his or her company, not from the personal supply, to the bank, and moves this to a column on the other side of the board. The die moves up to the highest available space, which is not an executive action space, and the player then immediately drafts that die, performing the action as printed. This icon here shows the cost of doing this action. Note that there are a couple of limitations. Players cannot move a die into an executive action space, even if it began in an executive action space, and a player cannot move a die to a different column in the same side of the board. The first part of the contract and load action is to take a contract. If the player wishes to take a contract, then he or she must take the face-up contract card from the column from which the die was drafted. The player takes that card and then either places it with the flag side face up or to the generic side with the flag face down. Whichever option the player chooses, the player then fills up that contract card with dice from his or her warehouse. These are the dice in this box of that player's colour. The player rotates the dice to match the numbers shown. If the player runs out of dice in the warehouse, the player may take dice from the dice pool, adding it like that. But if the player runs out of dice in the dice pool, the player may not take the contract. The contract is then filled with this face-up contract from this space, and the top one from the deck is placed here to replace it. So you'll always know the next two contracts that are coming out. If the player chooses the generic side, all generic cargoes will be number 3. Dice remain on a player's contract cards until they have been loaded onto ships, and any card which still has dice on it is considered an unfinished contract. A player is not allowed to have more than 2 unfinished contracts at the end of his or her turn. So while it would be legal to take this third card during a player's turn, the player would then need to complete one of these contracts through the load actions later in the turn in order for it to be a legal move. If the player cannot fill one of these contracts later on the turn, then the player cannot take the new contract. The player can draft one of these dice and decline to take the contract, simply taking the load actions. The second part of the contract and load action is to load cargo from unfinished contracts onto ships. The number of load actions that the player gets is shown under the die that is drafted. So drafting this one would give the player 2 load actions. In its simplest form, one load action allows a player to take 1 die from an unfinished contract and place it onto either a ship or onto the railway section of the board. Doing this during the game is subject to a number of limitations. Firstly, when loading cargo from the flag side of a contract, that cargo may only go onto ships in that country's corresponding loading zone. Dice cannot be loaded onto a military ship as indicated by the red X's. However, it can be loaded onto any other ships, including your own or another player's. Dice can also be loaded onto neutral ships, such as the cruise ships or this cargo ship. When loading cargo onto cargo ships, the loading limits of that ship, both the minimum and maximum, must be respected. This is the range of total pips on dice on that ship, which must be met for the ship to sail. And so this one here with a 2 to 5 range could not see a 6 loaded, and it would be overweight, or a 1 because it would be underweight to sail. If loading a 2-slot ship from 5 to 11, it's acceptable to underload it with the first die, but you could not then come in and underload it with the second die to fill it up. When loading dice with a pip value of 1 or 2, that die can be loaded either as freight cargo, or it can go onto a cruise ship representing a cruise passenger. This can be remembered by the 1.2 icon shown on all of the slots of a cruise ship. As for freight cargo, the cruise ship must be located in that flagged region's loading zone in order to load it. Any cargo container with this railway icon can only be loaded onto the railway. All of the previous rules about loading into the flagged region do not apply. To load onto the railway, take the die and place it into this section of the railway in the leftmost available space. Once there are 4 dice here on a given round, the railway is full and no further cargo can be loaded onto it. In that case, this cargo would be stuck here until the following round. When loading cargo from the generic side of a contract, the player has much greater flexibility. If loading onto ships, this cargo can go onto a ship in any of the 4 loading zones on the board. When the generic cargo has a ship and rail icon, this cargo can go either onto a ship or onto the railway section if there is space. This is distinct from the flag side rail cargo, which must go onto the rail. The 2 most important limitations to consider when planning out your load action are that you're limited to loading the number of cargo shown under the die that you've drafted, so in this case 3, and that you cannot load more than 1 die onto a given ship or onto the rail in the same turn. So for this action here, the player only has 3 load actions, so would not be able to load all 5 of these cargo. And the player would not be able, for example, to load both of those here and this one onto the rail, because that would be putting 2 cargo onto the same ship. The player would be able to load it like this, as all of them would be onto different ships or onto the rail. A player may also spread the load actions across different unfinished contracts, but must still meet the different ships rule. In order to facilitate the load action, there are a number of maneuvers that a player is allowed to take as free actions in between loading actions. The first of these is that a player may move any ship, again one of his or her own ships or another player's ships, from this light blue waiting area into the country's flagged loading zone in order to load cargo onto it. Additionally, a player's company may build or deploy ships in between load actions in order to provide a ship to take the load. To build a ship, the player's company pays the amount of money shown on the board, which is $5 for this small ship and $7 for this larger ship, pays that money to the bank from the company, and adds the ship to this off-board collection of built ships. The player may then deploy one or both of these ships into one of the light blue waiting boards on the board, either this one here or there's one over the other side of the board. Deploy the ship and then move it into the relevant loading zone to take the load. All of these moves can be done in between load actions. There are 2 limitations to these maneuvers. Ships that are already in a loading zone cannot move back to go into the other loading zone, and you cannot move a ship into a loading zone unless you intend to immediately put cargo onto it. As before, you can maneuver your own ship or another company's ship or a neutral ship in this manner, but you cannot build other companies' ships or deploy other companies' ships for them. When you complete a contract with a flag on it, immediately take one of that country's flag tokens from the stack and place it into the leftmost space of the relevant column on your board. As you build up during the game, there will be various bonus actions that this unlocks, and I will talk about those later on in the video. Although there are only 3 spaces for each country's flag, you can have an unlimited number of that country's flag. Once the contract is complete, discard the card. If you complete a generic contract, there is no flag bonus for doing so. Simply discard the card. If the contract draw pile runs out at any point during the game, shuffle up discarded contracts and place them to form a new draw deck. The next major action is movement. When drafting a movement die, take note of the number of lock and waterway movement actions and keep track of them with these 2 markers up here. You will have to take all of the movement actions associated with the die you've drafted, so keep track of movements using this track. This path on the board represents the canal. There are ocean spaces at each end which represent the start and end of any journey, depending on which direction you're going through the canal. There are 9 movement spaces in between the oceans, so it takes a total of 10 steps to traverse the canal. Some of the spaces have the lock icon that we saw before, and some have the waterway icon. When moving ships through the canal, the ship will start on one side and will follow a one-directional path along its side of the canal. The ship cannot turn around and go the other way, and will not interact with any ships that are coming in the opposite direction. In order to move a ship out of the loading zone, it must meet its loading criteria, which is indicated by the numbers on the ship. A military ship, because it does not require loading, is always eligible to sail. A cargo ship can only sail if the total number of pips on it meets the range shown underneath the dice. So in this case, the ship must be between 2 and 5. It meets 3, this ship is able to sail. This ship has only 3 pips and requires 5, so it cannot sail. This one, which requires 7 and has 9, can sail, even though all 3 of its slots are not filled. For cruise ships, any of the black numbers shown on the cruise ship must be covered by a passenger. So this ship would be eligible to sail, but this one requires 1 more passenger before it can sail. A ship will never gain or lose cargo while it is in the canal, so you won't need to perform this sailing check again once the ship is already sailing. For a single movement point, a player may move either one ship or a group of ships which is no more than 4 slots in length. A player may move neutral ships, ships of his or her own company, or ships from another company. To move a single ship, move the ship 1 space forward on the canal and spend the type of action point for the icon that was passed by the ship, in this case waterway. The player can continue doing this with all these actions. It would cost a lock action to move there, another lock action to move there, another lock action to move into this lake, and then a waterway action to move here. The player would then be out of actions. Players may split their actions between different ships, even going in other directions. A player may also use 1 movement point to move a group of ships. Starting from an ocean area, a player may form a group of ships by joining any number of ships together, as long as the total length is not longer than 4. This group could then be moved using a single waterway action into this first lock. Once the group has been formed, it will move together as a single group and cannot be split apart until it reaches the next lake. So for the next lock action, a player could not simply move the red ship forward. It would have to move all of these ships together. Once a group enters a lake, that group breaks apart. Players can then reform that same group or a new group, or even continue to move solo across the board using actions. So for a waterway action, that broken apart group could then be split into this new group, which then moves into the next section. Once again, this new group will remain and can only move together until it reaches the next lake. There is a limit of 4 slots in any of the lock spaces or in the Culebra cut space. When a ship enters a lock or this cut space and there are already ships in that space, one of 2 things can happen. If the ship enters and the total of those ships, both the ones that were there and the ones that just entered, is 4 slots or less, those ships immediately form a group. and they will move together until the next time they reach a lake. If the incoming ship and the existing ships are longer than 4 slots, then the ship or group of ships in the forward space is pushed forward 1 spot to make room for the incoming ship. If that pushes them into a lake, that group breaks up as before. This mechanism allows players to push multiple ships quickly through the canal by feeding ships into locks and pushing them. Ships cannot be pushed out of the 2 lake spaces, and there is no limitation to the number of ships or the length of ships in either of those lake spaces. Note here that each side of the lake, each direction of the lake, is kept separate. The ship cannot turn around and go into the other side of the lake. Moving military ships around can be a useful way of pushing cargo ships through the canal. But additionally, you can gain a personal money payout by moving military ships. When you move a military ship, and strictly that means moving a ship, not pushing it with another ship, look at the type of military, in this case EU, and look at how many of that military's flags you have on your company board. Then receive $1 into your personal supply, not your company supply, for each flag. There are some caveats to this payment. You can only be paid by 1 military per turn, and you only get paid once by that military. So if in this turn I had moved the EU and the US East military ships, I would look at the one for which I had the most flags, in this case EU, and take only 1 payout for that. The other caveat is that if a player has more than 3 flags from the country whose military ship was moved, the player receives a maximum of $3. A player must spend all movement points associated with the die that he or she drafted, even if this is of no benefit to the player. This could involve moving other players' ships or other players' cargo, or simply pushing military ships around the board. The process which is followed when a ship exits the canal depends on what type of ship it is. Ships are resolved in the order they exit the canal, including if they're part of a group. So for this group, this ship would be resolved first, followed by this, followed by this. When commercial cargo exits the canal, firstly, the company which owned the cargo is paid for it. So in this case, the yellow company would earn $5 for this cargo. This goes into the company money. If a ship with multiple players' cargo on it exits the canal, both companies are paid. So in this case, the yellow company would immediately receive $3 and the red company would receive $2. In the specific case of the San Juan Prospector ship, each company is paid double for one of the cargoes on that ship. So, as this one exits the canal, the red company would take double 6 is 12, plus 3 is $15, and the green company would take double 3 is 6, plus 1 is $7. After the owner of the cargo has had money paid into his or her company, the owner of the ship receives a bonus in the form of these cards. A player who owns a single slot ship which leaves the canal takes the top captain card. This is a card which helps with movement through the canal. A player who moves a 2-slot ship out of the canal takes the top stevedore card. This is a card which helps with the contracts and load action. A player who moves a 3-slot ship out of the canal looks through all of the remaining financial advisor cards and chooses one of them. These cards provide an endgame bonus means for players to earn personal money based on what their company has been doing. I'll explain how all of these cards work later. Players can only hold one captain card and one stevedore card at a time, but can hold as many financial advisor cards as desired. If the player cannot take this bonus or does not wish to take the bonus, then the player may take personal money, indicated by the coin and the Meeple icon, as indicated here. $2 instead of a captain card, $3 instead of a stevedore, or $5 instead of a financial advisor. Note that this money goes to the person, not the company. When a cruise ship exits the canal, this is resolved differently. The company whose cruise passenger it is takes the top token from the cruise token pile. The company then receives the amount of money printed on that token, in this case $5, and the company places that token on one of these three spots on the company board. This gives that company a bonus which can be used for the rest of the game, and I'll talk about what these are later. The cruise tokens reduce in value from $5 down to $1 through the game. Once all the tokens are gone, there is no payment, nor is there a player board bonus, for pushing cruise cargo through the canal. If multiple companies have passengers on the same cruise ship, the cargo tokens are handed out in turn order. That is, starting with the player whose turn it currently is, and progressing in turn order, finishing with the player who had played most recently. So if it were the yellow player's turn, yellow would get the higher value cruise token, and red the lower value cruise token. When a military ship exits the canal, there is no effect. After resolving the end of canal actions, all dice that were taken off ships are placed into the dice pool, and all ships are placed into the waiting area at that side of the board. They are ready to be loaded and moved again, starting over here and going backwards. Drafting a die from the top row, that is the one with the dashed lines, allows the player to take one of the two executive actions, either to buy a share or boost share price. Buying shares involves a player putting money into one of the companies, either his or her own company or another player's company, hoping to earn dividends and capital growth on those shares. To buy a share, the player chooses the company that he or she wishes to invest in, say red is buying in yellow, pays the share price, which is indicated at the location of that company's cube on the left-hand side of this track. So in this case, $6. The player pays $6 of personal money into the company supply of the company whose share is being bought, and takes a share certificate into his or her personal supply. The share price of that company increases one step when this happens. There is no limit to the number of shares that a player can hold in his or her personal portfolio, and there is no way to sell these shares back to the company during the game. However, all shares will be sold to the bank for its current share price at the end of the game. From each company's perspective, the company has a total of 5 share certificates available in the game, and the company cannot refuse to sell a share to a player who wishes to buy it. The other executive action available to a player is to increase the share price of his or her own company by 2 steps. This will increase the resale value of any shares at the end of the game, as well as the dividend which is paid out each round. A player can only do this with his or her own company. A player cannot increase another player's company value. Now that we understand the mechanics of the game, we'll go through the general flow of the game from start to end. I've set this board up for a 4-player game, although you can only see one of the player boards. This is the setup up to step 20 in the rulebook, and I won't go through every step of the setup, but I'll highlight some key points. The player starts with 1 share in his or her own company and $6, and the company starts with $18, 2 unbuilt ships, 1 built ship, and 4 remaining shares. Each company has one slot ship already on the canal with a 3 cargo on it, with the starting location depending on turn order, and you'll be able to see that printed on the board for where each player begins. The 8 neutral ships begin in the locations as indicated in the rulebook, and each player begins with 4 dice in the warehouse and 4 dice in the dice pool. Next, players draft starting financial advisor cards. Each player takes 2, looks at their cards, passes 1 to the player to their left, they will receive 1 from the player to their right, look again, and then choose the one they want to keep. All leftover financial advisor cards will sit in this pile ready to be taken as a bonus during the game. Next, a number of starting contract cards equal to the number of players plus 1 is dealt out onto the table. In reverse turn order, players take it in turns to take one of these contracts, take the dice associated with it, and then may immediately load them onto ships the same way as they would during a normal turn. This means players are able to deploy ships and build ships and maneuver ships around these regions in order to complete that action. If the player completes the action, he or she takes a flag as normal. If not, it remains as an incomplete contract until it has been loaded during the game. Note that the starting contract has no generic side. After all players have chosen their starting contracts, the one remaining one is discarded from the game, and these are not used again. This is the completionist setup. After this, play moves into round 1, and in turn order, players will take turns to draft dice and take actions as described before. The round ends when all of the dice are gone. This will be 4 actions each in a 3 or 4 player game, and 6 actions each in a 2 player game. This is what the board might look like at the end of round 1. Next, go through the end of round phase. There are 6 steps in this. Firstly, move the rail cargo from the first wagon to the second wagon and resolve the new turn order. The new turn order is based on who has the most pips on the railway. So in this case, yellow would become first player. In the case of a tie, the player who is further to the left of this, in other words, the player who placed the cargo earlier in the turn, breaks the tie, and if there's still a tie, existing turn order holds. Any player with no cargo there goes last, with existing turn order holding. Next, move the rail cargo to the final wagon. In the new turn order, any player who has at least 1 die on the rail gets to choose 1 flag to add to his or her player board. There is 1 flag available of each country, and once one has been taken, it will not be refilled for the remaining players. So, yellow could choose 1 flag, green would choose from the flags that remain, then red, but black would not get to choose because black has no dice on the rail. Placing the flag on the player board at this point may activate a bonus. Many of these are bonus actions, and I'll go through them later in the video. But if a bonus is activated, that will take place now. This may give players an extra action on the canal. Dice from the rail are then placed in the dice pool. The third step is to pay cargo fees. Each company will pay fees on every die in its colour, except for dice in this section of the board. The fee paid for each die is shown in a purple rectangle at the location of the die. In general, Cargo fees become cheaper the further a player has shipped that cargo. The most expensive cargo, costing $5, is anything left in the warehouse, that is, anything which hasn't even been loaded onto a contract card. Any dice left on contract cards, or any dice in a loading zone, cost $4. On the Canal, it's indicated in these spaces, but it will be anywhere from $1 to $3, generally more expensive in locks than on lakes. Anything in the dice pool costs $0. So the player counts up the total amount of fees. Looking at red, it's 5, plus 4 is 9, plus 4 is 13, plus 3 is 16, plus 1 is 17, plus 1 is 18. The player then pays that money from the company's supply to the bank. The player pays no fees, and the company pays no fees, for its ships, only for its dice. If the company is short on money to pay for its cargo fees, the player will have to chip in from his or her personal supply in order to make up the shortfall. If the player does not have enough money, the player must be bailed out by the bank. The player takes this token and $10 from the bank and chips into the company. At the end of the game, this $10 will have to be repaid with interest, such that the player will lose $15. The fourth step is for the company to pay dividends to its shareholders. To do this, first look at how many shares that company has sold. And in the case of red, it is 2. The red player holds 1 and the yellow player holds 1. Then, based on that company's position on the market track, look at the current dividend cost. In this case, $3. The company will then pay $3 for each share from the company's money into the respective player monies. If the company does not have enough money to pay all of its dividends, then it pays none of its dividends. The share price of the company drops by $2. In this case, the player does not chip in from his or her personal supply to make up the money to pay out dividends. The company must have that money available after paying its cargo fees. The fifth step is to hand out the Managing Director Award for the round. The player whose company has the highest share value receives that round's Managing Director token. This is worth a cash bonus to the player at the end of the game. $3 in round 1, $5 in round 2, and $7 in round 3. It is an end of game cash bonus, so the player cannot receive the money now and reinvest it into other companies. Only companies which paid out dividends in this round qualify for this award. And in the event of a tie for share value, the company with the most cash on hand is the company that receives the award. The final step is to set up for the next round. New flag tokens are placed on the rail, and then all cargo from the dice pool is shifted to the warehouse, moving it from the 0 fee area to the 5 fee area. Companies will need to move all of this cargo again in the next round to avoid a high fee. Finally, re-roll the white dice and set up for the next round. Play follows in the same manner in rounds 2 and 3, and the same end of round phase occurs in both rounds. After the end of round phase in round 3, the game is over, and players total up their money to determine who wins. Players begin with any money that they've gained during the game. Any Managing Director tokens at this point are cashed in for money. Players then reveal their Financial Advisor cards. These will give an endgame bonus based on what the company has been doing. Players may collect as many of these as they wish, but they may only score 2 of them. So players will determine the 2 most valuable cards and receive cash for them. I'll go through what the bonuses are in the next part of the video. Next, Players cash in their shares by selling them to the bank for the current share price as indicated by the location of the cube on the board. Finally, if the player has received a bailout token from the bank at any point in time, the player must pay that back plus its interest to the bank. Players total up their total amount of cash, and whoever has the most money wins. In the event of a tie, the final turn order, which is determined by the rails in round 3 and otherwise has no purpose, determines the winner. Panamax has a variety of bonus actions that you can unlock by either taking these cards or by putting tokens onto your company board. To play a captain card, the player flips the card and immediately receives the number of movement points shown on the back. This is between 3 and 5, with cards nearer the top of the pack having more actions. Although this shows the waterway movement icon, these movement points may be taken as a mix of either lock or waterway actions. The card cannot be played on the same turn in which it was received, but when it is played, it counts as if it were a completely separate movement action to any other movement action the player takes on that turn. So if the player receives a military ship bonus for a normal movement action, an additional military ship bonus can be taken for the captain card. When it is played, it is placed on the bottom of the captain card pile, ready to be taken again later in the game. The stevedore card may be played for one of two different actions, either an additional loading action or for a discount on cargo fees. To use it for an additional loading action, the player takes one load action which is considered separate to any others taken on that turn. The player may take a die from an unfinished contract and load it onto a ship, or if the player has no such cargo, the player may take a die from his or her warehouse, set it to the number 2, and load it onto any ship on the board. As for the captain card, this cannot be played on the turn in which it was received. And because it is considered a completely separate load action, this may be used to load cargo onto a ship which already has received cargo from that player in that turn. The second option for the stevedore card is to play it during the end of round phase and receive a discount on cargo fees. The top two stevedore cards cut the cargo fees in half for that round, and all of the others give the company a $3 discount on total cargo fees for the round. As for the captain card, when a stevedore card is played, it is placed onto the bottom of the main pile on the board. The financial advisor cards are 9 bonus objective cards which will give the player personal money based on the performance of their company. The full explanation of how these work are in the supplemental sheet that comes with the game. But these 5 give the player bonuses based on the flags that their company has obtained. These 2 give the player a bonus based on the number of cruise passengers they have obtained. This one gives a player extra money for dividend paying shares, and this one allows the player to take any leftover money from his or her company as long as dividends were paid in the final round. The icons in these circles represent bonuses which are taken when the space is covered with the corresponding country flag. All players have the same mix of icons, although the icons are not in the same place on all player boards. Placing a flag on one of these 4 spaces immediately allows the player to buy a share, just as he or she would have with the main executive action. Note that the other executive action, raising your company's value by 2 points, cannot be taken here. The player can take this action immediately, or flip the flag over to this side, indicating that the action can be taken later. The player can then, at any time on a subsequent turn, flip this back over to buy a share. This must be done before the next flag is placed in the same row. Covering one of these two spaces immediately gives the player 3 movement points. This works the same way as the captain card. The points must be taken immediately, all 3 movement points must be spent, and if the player moves military ships during that time, he or she claims the bonus even if such a bonus has already been taken that turn. As for the captain card, these movement points may be a mix of lock and waterway actions, even though the waterway icon is used. This bonus is the same as the load bonus from the stevedore card. The player may load 1 die from an unfinished contract, or take a die from his or her warehouse, set it to the number 2, and then load it onto any ship on the board. The final bonus allows players to add extra cargo onto the rails. The player either takes a die from his or her warehouse, sets it to the number 2, and places it on the railway, or, if that can't be done, increase the number of pips on a die already on the railway by 2 points. These 3 spaces are for cruise tokens, and when a token is on here, it gives you a permanent bonus which enhances one of the other actions in the game. If a player has a cruise token on this icon, this reduces the cost of taking a die from one side of the board and moving it to the other. Whereas this would normally cost the company $5, with this bonus it costs only $2. The company can also unlock a further bonus on this by having at least one of each flag. If the company achieves this, switching a die is free. This bonus gives a player more choice of contracts. When drafting a die, the player may now choose from the contract in that column or one of the 2 incoming contracts. Contracts in other dice columns are still unavailable. This bonus gives the player 1 additional load action when taking a load action die. So drafting this die would give 4 load actions instead of 3. All of the usual strict restrictions regarding where dice can be loaded and the fact that only 1 die can be loaded onto each ship still apply. And that's how to play Panamax. If there's one tip I'll leave you with, it's to always remember that the game is won on personal money, not on company money. So don't get too attached to making your company the best it can be if it doesn't help your game. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you enjoyed playing. Please subscribe to our channel if you want to see more from Meeple University.